Our discussion today is the Technology Roundtable, Are You Staying on the Right Side of the Law? And I'm delighted to introduce three speakers. I think I'm going to give our audience a fascinating overview of the regulations and some of the latest thinking that's happening and information on what's happening with enforcement. So Dave, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Dave Nichols from DGN Solutions.
Yep, I'm Dave Nichols. I'm an independent consultant specialising in the outbound industry. I've been involved in the industry for over 20 years now, providing support with assessing Ofcom compliance. Also back in 2000, I was part of the industry group that worked with the Direct Marketing Association to put together the original set of rules that later on Ofcom adopted as their first set of policies.
So a lot of information and a lot of experience that Dave can share with us. Also delighted to introduce Darren Sullivan to you, who works with Ultracoms. Darren, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a pen portrait of what you're going to be covering today.
Certainly. Thanks very much, John T. I'm Darren Sullivan. I've been working in the industry about 15 years now. Ultracoms was set up as the first European cloud contact center solution, and what I'm particularly going to be covering today is the PCI compliance and a bit of a focus on certification as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm delighted to introduce Natasha Longson from the Information Commissioner's Office. And Natasha, if you'd just like to do a short introduction and give a short pen portrait of what you're going to be talking through.
Yeah, okay, my name is Natasha Longson. I've been working at the Information Commissioner's Office now for just over 9 years. I'm the Anti-Spam Investigations Team Manager, and basically we concentrate on looking at the way in which organisations comply with the privacy and electronic communication regs, and that is ultimately going to be what most of my talk is going to be about today.
That's wonderful, and you'll also be sharing some of the work that you've been doing in terms of enforcement and sharing a bit some of the recent finds as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant, and I'm hoping Natasha will also be able to cover a few tips on what businesses can do to stay on the right side of the law. Yeah. There will be a replay available later on today. I know we'll be going through a lot of detail, and I know a number of you do like to share this with your teams or with other departments, so you can share that information widely. Alongside us, we do have the chat room running. That's callcenterhelper.com/chat. If you've got a question, use the hashtag question. If you've got a tip, leave a hashtag of tip. And we will pick a prize of a bottle of champagne or box of chocolates for the best tip or the best question, which we'll pick later on this afternoon and broadcast out on Twitter. So if you want a copy of the slides, if you log into this link at the bottom here, callcenterhelper.com/chat, and you can get the copies of the slides from there. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd just like to start off proceedings. I'd like to start off with a poll. And just like to ask the question, were you aware that there was recently an Ofcom consultation on silent and abandoned calls? So if you'd just like to vote on that, and the answers are yes, we have responded to that, yes, we were aware but we didn't respond, or no, I wasn't aware. Dave, have you got any guess of what you think the most popular answer is likely to be?
Well, I'm hopeful that lots of people knew about it, but looking, in terms of things, but possibly not. Yeah, basically, yeah, I think from the fact that there were about 40 responses, I think, that Ofcom received, I'm not sure that everybody on the webinar will have responded.
Well, let's have a look on the screen. So we've got 23% were aware and have actually responded. This is sample size of 82 people. 11% were aware but didn't respond, and 66% were not aware. So that's my first telling off. We did cover it twice in the Call Centre Helper, so reading our weekly newsletter would certainly have helped on that. But that's there is an alarm there that a lot of the industry aren't necessarily aware of things that are changing. Darren, have you got a thought on that?
Not really. We responded, so.
Yeah. So I think some more work to do overall on that. Well, I'm not going to hold up the proceedings anymore, and what I'd like to do now is I'd like to pass the baton across to Dave Nichols. And Dave, if you'd like to give us an overview of some of the regulations that we need to be aware of.
Okay.
Need to share your screen.
Yeah, clicking buttons.
There we are. We can see it fine.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start off really by talking a little bit about the current policies. So if you are using an outbound dialer today, these are the policies that you should be following. I'm not going to go through them in detail. We'll just talk about a few general points around it. The reason I'm calling the current policies is because of that consultation, which has the potential to change some things. But just general background on these policies, they have been around since about 2010, and they have, Ofcom have fined people based on them. They have done a number of enforcement actions around them, and most of these policies are reasonably clearly defined. There have been a certain amount of sort of woolliness around certain parts of it, and some of the calculations, and different people have calculated differently. But essentially, it's been quite solid and reasonably well understood by people using dialers. What it doesn't do is cover some of the technologies that have really been used a lot more in recent times, particularly interactive voice messaging and SMS, which have kind of both come along and grown very quickly since the policies were put in place. One of the key things about these policies is they have generally been considered to be what I would refer to as a safe harbor. That is, you could be reasonably confident that if you were meeting all of these rules and you had very clear understanding of the rules and that you were following them and documenting that if Ofcom came knocking on the door, you would be basically safe. You would have they would be able to, they would be satisfied with your answers, and they would go away again. Now, as has been mentioned, there has been a recent consultation. Now, I want to stress at the beginning of this, what I have on screen are items that are within the consultation. They are not law yet. They were things that Ofcom were floating as the way they were seeing as moving forward. They have received some fairly robust responses to some of these, so we're awaiting, what will happen, what they will actually come out with. But just to highlight, a few things within here. They clear up some things that historically haven't been mentioned but have been there in the background. So, for example, around how small numbers of silent calls or abandoned calls can potentially be considered to be persistent misuse. In practice, they have never really used the powers in that way because their enforcement tries to work from the worst offenders downward. There are some issues with that, which I'll come to in a moment. But most of the rules, they are controlled by the underlying legal situation, which is the Communications Act, which basically means that they have to define what persistent misuse is, and having defined it, all of the rules are kind of based off of the back of that, so it gives them limited movement in terms of what they can do. Some of the things that have been added in here, you will notice silent calls from other causes. So whether that is an agent hanging up on a customer or not speaking, whether that's a technical issue. As I say, there has been a lot of pushback on that because some of those things are very, very hard to control. The other one in here, which links across to what Natasha will talk about in some ways, Ofcom also are considering whether breaches of the privacy and electronics communications regulations would also be misuse. Now, those regulations are looked after by the Information Commissioner's Office, but specifically around the use of TPS, Ofcom are taking the position that if somebody's on TPS and you call them, that may annoy them, and by annoying them it becomes misuse of the network. So there are a number of things here, so we'll wait to see what comes out of it. The consultation concluded last week, and I know Ofcom are trying to get the responses analysed and any changes in a new policy out as quickly as possible. Another specific one to point out is IVM. IVM is now included specifically with some rules around timing and handling of messaging and things like that. So, a few things to remember about Ofcom and the way they work. They define the rules under which they work. The Communications Act makes them responsible for the policy, which defines persistent misuse. They then police it and enforce it. That basically makes them judge, jury, and executioner. They can take action on anything that they consider breaches the law, and breaching the law would be anything that causes unnecessary inconvenience, annoyance, or anxiety. So even if it isn't in their policies, it may still be considered misuse if they investigate. And the one very key point, bottom right here, is they drive enforcement based on complaints. So they have their own complaints line that people can call. They also gather data from nuisance call bureaus, from various telcos and service providers, and based on the number of complaints they have in a particular period, they will then decide whether or not to look at companies and decide whether they then have problems with misuse, whether there needs to be a fine, whether there needs to be advice given as to how to move forward. So it is a very sort of enclosed thing. It is quite hard to argue against an Ofcom rule because it's a rule that they create. So it is quite important that, that you bear that in mind when you are deciding on your own activities. So not going to give advice on any of the specific rules, but in terms of best practice, the things that I feel everybody should be doing is make sure you really understand the rules. Some of them take a little bit of understanding. The calculations take some understanding. If you are using answer machine detect, you have to understand how you calculate false positive rates, how you include that in your other calculations. You should always not just look at the letter of the law and say, well, it says I can do 3%, I will do 3% abandoned calls. You should follow the spirit of it. So if that is inappropriate, and an analogy I would use for that is if you have, if you think of a 30-mile-an-hour limit road, that doesn't mean 30 miles an hour is always appropriate. If there are a lot of school children walking down the pavement and jumping around, or if there are people crossing the road, clearly you change your behaviour. So really following the spirit here and looking at that side of things rather than just saying how far can I go is important. Senior management being involved helps you to eliminate the kind of conflicts you get between the business performance and meeting the regulations. Clearly you have to meet the regulations, but sometimes that puts tension in terms of business performance. By having senior management engaged, you can cover that off and explain the situations. Ofcom will expect you to prove that you are compliant. It is not up to them to prove that you are guilty. So you must have very, very good records of your compliance, showing that you are following all the rules and how your policies work. And general advice, think like a consumer. We're all consumers as well as contact center people. Sometimes we walk into the office and don't always think the same way as we would if we were receiving a call at home. But you have to think about that. You know, if the call you're making, if you wouldn't welcome it, then is there something you can change about it that means that people would, and would you complain about it? Because, as I mentioned, complaints are important here. If you are being complained about, you will start to float onto Ofcom's radar, and it doesn't necessarily take a huge number of complaints to get you there. There have been people fined hundreds of thousands of pounds on the basis of less than 100 complaints, sometimes less than 50, if they've reached through to Ofcom, and that's put them at the top of the kind of complaints league table for the period. And following on from that, you should always prioritise your complaint handling. If an issue is raised to you, deal with it. Do not turn the customer away unhappy so that they go elsewhere, possibly to Ofcom or to the service provider. Make sure that you are clearing it properly. And if you are seeing your complaints rise, change the behaviours. You're obviously doing something that is going to get you into trouble, so understand what it is and deal with it from there. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Dave. We'd normally keep questions for longer, but I think would be appropriate to do now. And Nick has asked the question: can you specifically define what an abandoned call is in terms of outbound dialing? In inbound dialing, it's when someone hangs up before they reach you with the queue. Could you just sort of clarify that for Nick, please?
Okay, for an abandon on outbound is where you are using a predictive dialer and you have dialed the call, and then for basically usually just calculation reasons or bad luck in some cases, you have more people answering the phone that you need to speak to than you actually have agents available at the time. So there are strict timings, currently 2 seconds to get that call to an agent. If you cannot do that, you have to play an information message, which tells them who you are and the number to dial back on, and then you have to hang up the call, and that counts as an abandoned. And then the current rules are 3% of your live calls is the maximum that you can abandon.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much for that clarification on that. We're going to ask another poll of the audience, and that poll question we're going to do is: if you make automated outbound calls, do you have answer machine detection turned on or off? So, question for the audience: if you have if you're making outbound calls, do you have answer machine detection turned on or off? I know this has been, over the years, one of the biggest hot potatoes that we've asked. So if you would just like to vote on that, do you have answer machine detection in your contact center turned on or off? So let's just have a look at the results. Darren, I know this is a pet topic of yours. So in the audience, we've got 15% of it have it turned on, 68% turned off, and 18% not sure. Does that surprise you?
Not anymore, no. But about 5 years ago, the results would have been the opposite, I think. But we've spent probably 12 out of the last 15 years telling people to turn it off, and more recently, we've been telling people it's okay to turn it back on again, but we probably shouldn't go into that subject right now.
Presumably in quite tightly defined,
absolutely,
tightly defined areas. So yes, quite an interesting topic overall there. Well, I think it's probably time now to pass across to Darren. We've had lots of questions coming into the chat room, which will hold to answer your piece about PCI compliance and call recording in particular. So Darren, if you'd let's just transfer the baton across to you. See if we can get your slides up on the screen. And if you'd like to take us through your, just share, press the share my screen button there in the center. And if you'd just like to take us through your thoughts on PCI compliance.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk about PCI compliance and, in particular, certification. So, first of all, I thought we should have an examination of what is PCI compliance. It's a set of rules laid out by the PCI Security Standards Council to protect cardholder data from unauthorized access. It's really as simple as that. Where it comes to certification, we know that we have Ofcom and ICO compliance standards, but there's no certification process. So you might want to understand why we need a certification process for a PCI. I particularly like this phrase, trust and verify. It's a famous phrase used in various industries and political situations over the last couple hundred years. But it's also a highly apt way to think of the PCI DSS regulations. There's trust that all organizations are complying with the regulations. After all, no legitimate company would want to see a data breach. However, to verify a third party that your organization is complying, there's a mixture of self-assessment and independent assessment processes. So why would we need to go through that at the moment? You know, what difference does it make if I am certified? Well, the immediate reasons are that business owners, managers and service operators need to review certification is that their business customers are now requesting that their service providers verify their compliance. That they're not willing to go on trust anymore. You know, that's been the case. That has, until recently, been as a matter of trust. But they now require proof that their use of the merchant account information and the customer's personal data is secure. We're seeing that without certification, service providers such as outsourced contact centers are being rejected from tender processes quite early on. Be interesting to hear if anybody else has had that experience out there. Acquiring banks are already required by the industry to ensure that their clients are compliant, and they can only do this through certification. Acquiring banks can actually withdraw services if they choose, but that's not happening too much, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we have had experience that new applications for merchant card services are being firmly declined unless certification can be proved. This is the appropriate moment to highlight that the whole industry is self-regulating. It's simply not in the interest of, say, Visa to tell a supermarket chain that they must become compliant, else remediation steps will be taken. Visa earn their income out of the use of those cards and don't wish to hinder that use in any way. They don't want to publicise breaches, fines, and thus vulnerability, but they do want to reduce the frauds and protect their brands. So why is PCI DSS necessary? Well, the key drivers, or the overriding driver, is the frightening high level of fraud that has been taking place using card data. Most of the card data has been illegitimately extracted from companies that have been quite comfortable that they've been legitimately capturing it through their normal activities. Full compliance with the PCI DSS standard should mean that all IT systems are secure and customers' data, including the data provided when making payments, is secure. So what do I need to become certified? So the PCI DSS standards offer two processes that can be followed for certification. You can take external certification by a qualified security assessor, that's a QSA. You can have self-certification. I think one of our earlier callers mentioned that some large companies, they had an internal security assessor, but even though that they've got this internally trained person, the process they follow is still self-certification. External certification has statuses known as levels, and that's the levels I've got on the screen there. Those levels are actually set by the supplying merchant card provider. I think that one's Visa. External verification by QSA is onerous, it's very time consuming, and it's expensive. So having said that, why would anybody do it? Now, it's time consuming and costly. Why wouldn't I just go for self-certification? Well, from that previous grid, level 1 certification would be required if you'd ever had a breach before, or if your business criteria meant that you had to comply with that card payment provider. Now, that can be through volume. Here it's 6 million transactions a year. That's quite high. But your business activities, such as a payment service provider, would be absolutely required to become level 1 certified. You can also be just assessed as a risk, or your industry might be assessed as a risk. So people don't become externally certified on a whim. They would definitely go for internal certification if they could, but not everybody gets that opportunity. So the types of certification, if I carry on with that, on the self-certification, the PCI standards have made self-certification so that companies are able to formally declare their compliance status to anybody else that asks. The document that they provide is an attestation of compliance, an AOC. I think you'll come across that phrase quite often. The document consists of a series of declarations about business activities and processes. There are various different categories of self-assessment, and each is designed to match different companies' activities. Advice from external QSA can be taken, as I mentioned earlier. You can have your internal ISA, and it is quicker. It can be significantly less expensive, but really important down there at the bottom, it's the same standards need to be maintained, whether you're internally or externally validated. There's only one set of standards. Your declaration, your ASC, is not a declaration of what what a business has complied with and what they don't feel is necessary to comply with. It's a mandatory set of requirements, all of which must be met, unless the activity to which they refer is not being carried out by that business. And that's very important. So the self-certification process, this is a nice little grid, depicts each of the different ways you can become self-certified. Your company would only fall into one of those. The third column there actually highlights the number of questions, i.e. the number of declarations. Nobody wants to be in SAQD, as it's known down the bottom there. Everybody would like to be in the 14-question bracket at the top. Every compliance officer would be aiming for that. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. You'll only fall into one bracket or another. The PCI Council provides this flow diagram, which we're not going to linger on. I can say that most call centres will fall into SAQD categories, the one we're trying to avoid. However, not all is lost. It's often possible for an organisation to move from one category prior to their certification to make the whole process a lot easier. This is mainly achieved by ceasing non-essential card processing activities or outsourcing the card processing to somebody else that has invested in that external certification. So what's in the event of card data loss, what difference would it make? Well, if you did have a loss, you've got all the reputational damage, you've got the cost of the forensic investigation, fined by a merchant provider. The ultimate sanction is, as we said, they can take away that processing facility, but one that most people don't really comprehend is that you can be liable for all the fraud on those breached cards. So 1,000 cards, £1,000 a card, you're up to £1 million already. Self-certification does not shift away the liability for we just mentioned earlier. What it does provide is customer confidence and the mandatory documentation you need to prove that it's or to verify that you're certified. On its own, it does not provide liability protection. So, skipping on. So, external certification from a QSA who can contractually offer indemnity, that can move the liability further up the chain, or at least elevate it. Outsourcing the card processing data as a supplier that has themselves been externally certified, and thus they can provide an enforceable contract covering the liability, that can also do it. Quite a lot of suppliers out there will say that they're operating in a compliant fashion, but unless they can offer you a contract that covers your liability, which is high, then it's not moving your liability one iota. It's also not allowing you to become certified yourself. So what's the easiest route to certification is it's vital to reduce the scope of what needs to be evaluated for certification. We all want to go down the self-certification route. Easiest is SAQA, and the easiest way to do that is outsource the whole lot to the external provider. And why is scope so important? So I thought I'd bring this up on the screen. That we've got a contact center on the left-hand side there, and before they do everything, everything's in scope. Scope is generally and inaccurately used to refer to the card data environment, which is everything and everybody that comes into contact with card data. The PSDSI controls within the card data are extremely strict, so reducing the scope of that card data environment is highly beneficial. But what people don't fully understand is, although we've put in a piece of equipment here that's on the right-hand side taking away DTMF muting, everybody else is still in scope. They're still examined because they're managed in this diagram, the CD is accessed and managed by the same personnel, and humans are prone to making mistakes, so everybody is still in scope, but not necessarily the CDE environment. It's quite a difficult concept, but I can cover it in questions later if needed. Last point I think I cover is that the pause and resume, start recording gets a lot of press. So looking at our environment here of the contact center, if we put stop-start into this environment, it would only reduce the scope of the voice recorder as the card details still come into contact with everything else in the contact center. Now, the reason stop-start recording gets so much press is there's a mandatory requirement that CVV data is not recorded. Quite a lot of people say there's compensating controls, which is, I can redact the card information, I can encrypt it, I can delete it, but it's all too late. These are not acceptable compensation controls. You're not allowed to record for any period of time the CVV number. That's the only option, is not to record it in the first place. Best way to achieve certification is just outsource the whole of that pink area outside your building to a third-party provider, and then it's all their problem, and take a contract from them that helps you be indemnified. So in conclusion, achieving PCI certification is not a straightforward process, but it does take time and investment, and it's a necessity. The benefits far outweigh the cost of a breach. Certification is itself a relatively inexpensive process. It's the work that it takes to become certified that's where all the investment is. And that's it for the day.
Thank you very much for that, Darren. There's been a lot of questions coming on the chat room about PCI compliance, and also more generally about card details. So thank you, Darren. We're going to jump across to the chat room now. And Rachel, do you want to share with us some of the top tips that are coming in from the audience?
Yes, I can do. Right, let me just share my screen. Fab. So we've had one in from Jenny who's asked, the Ofcom consultation closed last week. Do you know when we can expect the revised policy to be published or implemented, please?
Dave, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah. Okay, I know Ofcom are keen to get it done as quickly as possible. They were talking about early in the year when it first went out, but it went out in the beginning of December and was due to finish in about a month earlier than it did. They extended it, so that will have moved out a bit. When it is implemented, I think they have said a 2 to 3 month implementation period from the point they publish the new policy. But so I can't be exact about it, but I know it's a kind of an accelerated thing. They want to get it done as quickly as possible. So, and I know they are already reviewing the responses and looking to move forward from there.
Fab. We've had another question in from Nick, who's asked, do you need to pause recording when a caller gives you direct debit details as opposed to credit card details?
Well, direct debit card details, as far as I'm aware, are not covered by PCI, but there is a whole load of data protection that you would have. I certainly know clients that do pause their recordings when they're doing direct debit card details. And they'll also pause things like screen recording as well.
I think, generally speaking, it's one where it would, if you've got the technology that can do this, it makes good financial sense to eliminate those details as well.
It would be best practice.
Best practice.
Fab. Is it common to ban cell phones in call centres where credit card information is being collected, so preventing screenshots with cell cameras? Says Christine, or asks Christine.
It is if you're operating what's known as a white room environment, where effectively the call center is still completely in scope, the card details are being passed all the way through to the agent. So there's a whole host of things that are used, including no writing materials, no recording material, such as cell phones. However, it's it's questionable whether that a white room is a compensating control that will be accepted.
I've certainly been into a number of contact centres where they have, I've been not quite searched, but asked to hand over my mobile phone before I go in, which is then stored in a locker. So it does prevent some idea, but I'd imagine it's always better if you could actually keep the card details away from the agent actually having to deal with that in the first place would make it more secure.
Certainly removing the human element is the most critical, but what's not fully underappreciated is even in a white room where there's no recording information, if it's physically possible for an employee or a contractor to plug into your network and start recording the calls as they're coming through, your environment is still fully in scope, and you have to be able to prove that they can't do that by encrypted SIP channels, etc. It's a very onerous world, and by far the easiest method is stop the card data getting to as much of your environment as possible, and that's that CDE environment we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Sarah's just asked in the chat room, what are your views on smartwatches, as they are able to record data but not easy to spot?
It's one of the reasons that compensating controls might suggest that requiring your agents to empty their pockets at the door of all their personal recording details is not really viable. I have heard of one customer come back and they were looking at doing this, and their union said, well, you just can't do that. So to become compliant, that wasn't a viable solution.
Yeah. Right, so we've got a question. PCI DSS requires that telephone calls that are being recorded prevent card payments being taken over the phone. Is it okay to have a single phone extension where there's no recording in order to take card payments? Asked Debbie.
It's back to that question of the card data environment. If I can be slightly facetious and say that you have that single extension in a locked room, and with keypad entry, and the equipment that serves that locked room is completely separate from the rest of the contact center, yes, that would be a acceptable compensating control, because you've made sure that the only place in the entire business that can access that card data is that locked room. It's not very practical to do that, but that is what you're trying to do. You're trying to remove the card's data from touching any human or any piece of equipment.
Fab. And we've got one final tip, which is from Neil, who says, my tip is that you should ensure that you don't allow the rules to mean you lose the culture of your business. I've seen many cases where this has happened. My personal opinion is that culture is imperative for a successful business, and it's all too easy to lose that when implementing so many processes and procedures. Which I think is great.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. We're going to be coming back to the. We've got lots of tips and lots of questions, but I think on the subject of culture is now a good time to hand across to Natasha, because I guess, Natasha, you see a great number of different cultures in your enforcement actions. I think that last point about look at the spirit of the rules rather than necessarily the trying to get, as Dave's point, as far up to the speed limit as you can is probably quite valid. Natasha, if you'd like to share your thoughts on some of the work you've been doing and at the ICO, and also perhaps throw in a few tips for how contact centres could stay on the right side of the law, would be great. Across to you.
Yeah, super.
Carry on.
Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about the way the regulations work, and also about some of the enforcement action the ICO's taken recently, and certainly going forward, put some tips for how the helpline industry can kind of look to improve and comply with the regulations. So obviously the regulations relate to the privacy and electronic communications regulations, and obviously that's in line with direct marketing. And there's 4 main regulations. as you can see, Regulation 19 is looking at automated calls, and with Regulation 19 it's important that individuals specifically opt into receiving those calls, and it's fair to say that a lot of individuals don't particularly want to receive automated calls. So if you're going to get consent for that type of call, you've got to make sure you can evidence it, because overall it's not a popular type of call to be received from individuals. Regulation 20 looks at the fax marketing side of things, and obviously in today's field that's fairly redundant now, but we do get the odd individual raising concerns with us about fax marketing. Regulation 21 looks at the receipt of live calls, and basically the thing to remember with Regulation 21 is to make sure that you're screening against telephone preference service. Currently, individuals do have to opt out of receiving live calls, and usually that's kind of like a tick box type of preference. But what I would say to that is that the new regulations that are coming in, looking around 2017, 2018, are likely to move all methods of marketing to an opt-in facility. So that's not been signed off yet, but certainly it's something to start bearing in mind for when the new regulations are implemented. And Regulation 22 looks at electronic mail, which includes email and SMS. And again, an individual does have to opt in for that type of direct marketing. Okay, so my next slide just talks about how all the legislation fits in together. I'm not going to go through each point, but basically what happens with the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations is it extends that part of the Data Protection Act covers the regulations, but what it doesn't do is under data protection an individual can bring a complaint to the ICO, and we're committed to making an assessment. Under the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations, that isn't the same, and actually we don't have to deal with individual complaints, but actually we can look at it under a more holistic approach, and basically use it from kind of an intelligence gathering field. Okay, so some of the biggest problems that we're looking at, or that we see in the ICO, are areas where we're receiving complaints about calls coming in about accident claims and lifestyle surveys. So in regards to the accident claims, obviously that's things like ambulance chases, you know, have you had an accident, that type of thing. And with the lifestyle surveys, you've got to be really careful, and I really can't stress that enough, because at the moment what's happening, and current trends seem to be that the lifestyle surveys, individuals are being contacted by lifestyle survey organisations, and they're not really surveys, it's basically lead generation for organisations to go out to people such as yourselves and sell them a data list. And what is the danger with that is it comes under a definition of something called sugging, which is selling under the guise of. So it isn't actually about a survey or direct marketing, market research, but actually it's about direct marketing of lead generation. So be very wary of that. There are fair processing issues about lifestyle surveys if it genuinely isn't one under the Data Protection Act. So you need to tread a real fine line with that one. Other areas that we're seeing regularly cropping up is the list broking situation, and basically this is the sale of telephone numbers with alleged consent for third-party use. Quite a lot of organisations will look to say, you know, we'd like to share your data with other third parties. Those third parties are never particularly identified, and certainly the area that it relates to can be pretty much any sector or any other organisation. So it's not enough to just say general third parties. And certainly from call centres and helplines, again, anything that you think you've got consent for, you need to be able to evidence that. There's new claim streams, and basically these are exhaustive. So we've all seen the situation with the banks where there was the request for claiming back charges. It then went on to the PPI. and then I think the newest ones at the moment are looking at health insurance from if you've been ill when you're on holiday. So that will always be an ongoing and changing environment. So historically for the ICO, we've had problems where we've had a large number of complaints, but basically with no deterrent. There's been no way we can take any kind of enforcement action, and it's been hard to deal with organisations where we've not been able to identify them. And as a result of all that, the ICO was subject to severe criticism. Then in May 2011, we basically got new powers in which we were able to issue civil monetary penalties for up to a maximum of £500,000. We've got the power to issue enforcement notices, and that basically is an order to stop organisations doing what they're doing. So if it is that we feel that you're flouting the rules and the regulations, we can make a legal enforcement notice to you to say stop what you're doing. And then obviously we've got the power to issue third-party information notices on telecom service providers. Now what that does is it's a means of being able to trace the numbers. So if we've got, for example, an organisation or a telephone number that is constantly being complained about, but perhaps we can't actually identify the organisation, the third-party information notice allows us to contact the service provider to basically locate where that telephone number has been coming from, and from there effectively trace that back to the organisation that's making the calls. And again, with that, we've also got our, the ability to run a NIC trace, which is a Network Interoperability Consultative Committee. And basically what that means is if we've got a call that's very recent and the individual that's received the call consents to it, we can again trace that call of where it's actually come and which organisation is actually making those calls. So in terms of going forward, we've now got a dedicated privacy and electronic communication regulations team. I'll refer to it as Pecker because obviously it's quite a mouthful. So we've got the dedicated Pecker Investigations team, which is made up of approximately 15 people. We've had the development of our intelligence hub, which, as I say, we basically collate information gathered from individuals that are receiving the calls, and from there we can start to build a picture about the way in which direct marketing scene is working. And we also have the development of our Snap Survey online reporting tool. I provided a link there, but basically what that does is it's an easy way for individuals to report their concerns if they are receiving direct marketing. Okay, so to give you a real life example, basically we had an organisation and it was 3 AM in the morning and individuals were receiving an automated call in the middle of the night, basically reminded them that dark nights are drawing in and how safe is your home. Now, at the best of times, that's not going to be particularly well received, but 3 AM in the morning, it definitely doesn't go down well, and certainly it was non-discriminative, so the call was not only annoying, but it was distressing to people because it was going out to the elderly, vulnerable people as well. So certainly, you know, that was a big deal, and we received a lot of complaints about this organisation. As a result of that, we issued a civil monetary penalty notice, and that was to direct security marketing, where we issued a penalty of £70,000. We've also recently issued penalty notices to an organisation called MyIML, and basically that was for £80,000, and they were cold calling people registered on the TPS, and they weren't screening against it. So, you know, it's a direct contravention of the regulations, and then if you're not choosing to comply with them, you can, you know, expect to kind of be hearing from the ICO because, you know, it's not on basically. The largest fine we've issued today is against a company called ProDial, which has gone out this week, and that's for £350,000. And basically with ProDial, they generated 46 million automated calls, and they were also hiding their identity, which is another part of the regulations. You're not meant to do that. You are meant to identify, you know, who the organisation is. So as a result, they were fined 350,000. So, you know, what I would say is, the rules are there, and that we provide guidance and everything to kind of help organisations to get through what the regulations say. So at the moment, the results for the ICO, we've got civil monetary penalty fines totaling just over £2 million, either issued or in the process of being issued since the 6th of April. And that's to 17 organisations, and those fines range between £40,000 and £350,000. They involve live text calls and automated calls, and there's 10 notices of intent issued with regards to enforcement notices. And we've also issued just over 1,000 third-party information notices issued for the year. What I would stress as well is that we do work in a tiered approach where it's not all about kind of waving the big stick and punishing organisations. Certainly that's our first tier in terms of the informal enforcement action, but we also look at monitoring and compliance. So where companies are largely engaging with us, and perhaps we've had some complaints, but they're not massive numbers. Most organisations aren't purposely trying to not be compliant. They do want to do their best, and in those situations, we can offer advice to them and give them an opportunity to improve the way in which they work, and that normally is about a 3-month monitoring period. And basically what that does is it allows the organisation to demonstrate to their customers that they are committed to being compliant with the regulations and putting measures in place. And then our last tier of enforcement is educating and advising organisations. So it might be that you're going to change your business model and you need some advice in terms of the best way to do that, or if you're unsure of the way the regulations, any impact it might have, and we can certainly talk to organisations about that as well. So from your guys' point of view, in regards to tips about how you should go about the privacy in electronic communications, there's kind of key things to think about. The first one, for live calls, make sure you're screening against TPS. I can't stress that enough. It's not enough to be signed up to it. You need to be screening against the telephone preference service, because it's the quickest downfall in terms of the regulations. Make sure you've got valid consent and that you've got evidence for this, because it's not enough to just say I've got third-party consent and individual said it was okay, because if we get complaints about an organisation, we will come to you and we will ask to see where your consent is, and an IP address isn't enough. You need to show what you were telling customers or what the third party was telling customers. And as I say, be able to demonstrate that you do have valid consent. And then obviously have sufficient due diligence processes in place when you're contacting, for example, your data providers. And also one of the big issues we have is in regards to affiliates. So make sure you're keeping any affiliates in check, because at the end of the day they are your responsibility. If an affiliate messes up and is not compliant with the regulations, then it's you as a data controller that we will be coming to ask the questions of, and it's your responsibility to make sure that they are doing what they need to be doing. I don't know if you're aware or not, but basically there's been a consultation recently for valid CLI being displayed on calls. I've put a link on there so you can go and have a read of what's going on there. That all closed a week or so ago, and basically what the government are wanting is going forward is for anyone making direct marketing calls, for them to display a CLI when they're calling individuals. So be aware of what's going on there. And then the final thing to mention is in relation to the general data protection regulations. I mentioned it earlier on. The new regulations are coming into play for 2017-18. They've not been signed off yet, so it's not something to get too panicky about, but certainly keep it on your radar, be aware of what's going on, and certainly the detail for information like consent and the definitions, the detail will be in the recitals, so that's where you need to be looking. But certainly in terms of going forward, that is going to be the biggest thing change, is that there's going to be a much more specific definition of consent in the GDPR. But as I say, that's all moving forward, and you can find out that on our website as we go forward with that. So
Natasha.
in terms of keeping in touch, you can subscribe to our newsletter at ico.gov.uk, or you can find us on via the usual social networking sites. And as I say, you can find out about anything that's coming up. So, for example, the GDPR, the consultations, any changes to legislation, or any guidance. We always produce best practice and guidance going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Natasha. Some fascinating insight there, and certainly the takeaway lesson I've learned from that is that make sure that you get consent, screen against the TPS, and make absolutely sure that you can document that consent amongst others. So some fascinating insight there, and I think certainly the ICO has done a great deal of improvement over the last 3 years in the work you've been doing there, and you can see that in some of the results you're getting there. We've got time for a couple of questions now. We're going to jump across to Rachel on the chat room, and I think you're going to start with a question for Natasha on collecting debt.
Yeah, Williams asked, if the rules are based on customer complaints, how does this work when trying to contact customers in reference to arrears management? They could complain at a company trying to contact them as a way of avoiding payment?
Okay, so the regulations relate specifically to direct marketing. So it's not, there's a few things to just clear up there. The regulations aren't based on customer complaints. It's just that we rely on customers to basically highlight any issues and report to us about any organisations that are not complying with the rules, basically. So it's not just based on customer complaints. However, in terms of things like, for example, debt collection and things like that, that isn't defined as direct marketing. And certainly when individuals report to the ICO, we require certain information from them. So it's not enough to just say, I've had a direct marketing call off company A. We need further information off that. And certainly, even if we did receive complaints and it did appear to be direct marketing, we would still contact that organisation. And, you know, there are some cases where an organisation will come back to us and say, actually, we do have consent and this is here it is, and they can evidence it. So it's not just taken at face value that, you know, people raising complaints about organisations are always right. That is the whole point of the investigations team, is that we do go away.
So you think in a lot of cases that in terms of collecting up debt, that as part of the contract you have with, you know, for instance, a credit card, or if you're in a housing association, part of that is giving the consent as part of the contract to be able to be
It wouldn't even fall under the privacy regulations, because the regs talk about direct marketing, and that wouldn't be direct marketing. So first of all, that's the first important point. And then the second thing, in regards to, for example, arrears management, what normally happens would be, as you say, part of a contract, or the individual would be told at the beginning, before they even sign up to it, that if you don't keep up payments, then we are likely to take this course of action. So the individual has been told, and certainly in terms of a data protection point of view, that's one of the first things it says. The first principle talks about telling individuals what to expect is going to happen with their data and what is going to happen going forward. So in that example, it wouldn't be defined as direct marketing, and certainly from a data protection point of view, there's a good chance that the contract will stipulate right at the beginning and the outset of it all, before it's got to any debt side of things, that this is what will happen if you don't keep up payments.
We've got time for one more question, one more tip, Rachel.
Fab. Okay, so Angela's asked, where is the best place to get an overview of the best practice rules for outbound dialing?
Okay, if I could just very briefly, the previous question I think also has an Ofcom thing as well, because Ofcom do use the complaints as ways of triggering investigations. But basically the same would be true in that if a customer complains and Ofcom come to you and you can show that you were calling responsibly, then that would prevent any issues. It's why, again, you need the evidence of the calling practices you're using and that you're not not dropping lots of calls and that sort of thing. In terms of best practice rules, I would say you have to start with the policy. I think the easily understood in brackets there is probably a bit of an issue with that. But you
That's
have
why
to
we
start
need to
there
do an article on call center helper, Dave, in order to do that. We're rushing away on time. Rachel, have we got a quick tip before we?
Yep, Steve said ensure that there is DPA included in all your training. That way it becomes part of all your processes and people can make the link to it as part of their day-to-day work.
I think that's a very sensible approach there. We've reached the top of the hour. In 1 or 2 words, if you could just put into the chat room, what did you like best about the webinar? You can watch a replay of the webinar. I know there's a lot of detail we've gone through there. callcenterhelper.com/recorded webinars. That will be available later on this afternoon. And I'd just finally like to thank all of our speakers, to Dave Nichols from DGN Solutions. Thank you, Dave.
You're very welcome. It's great to be here.
I'd like to thank Darren Sullivan from Outbound.
Thanks for listening in.
And thank you, Natasha, for joining us from the Information Commissioner's Office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We're back in a couple of weeks' time to look at the best ways of collecting customer feedback. So if you'd like to complete the survey on your way out, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.